All right, by a show of hands, how many of you have ever been to a baby shower? Oh, that's a lot of you. Okay. How many of you have ever had a baby shower? Like your friends and family threw you a baby shower? Okay, we're getting closer to everyone there. How many of you have ever been to a little kid's birthday party? Okay, almost everyone. How many of you were a little kid and someone threw you a birthday party? All right, okay, like that's everyone, right? All right. Now let me ask you this. How would you feel if in the middle of that shower or in the middle of that party that there was a knock at the door, and when you opened the door, there were a bunch of wizards who wanted to come in? Now, I'm not talking like Gandalf and Harry Potter. That would be really cool if those guys showed up, especially if you had a Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter themed party. I'm not talking about those guys. I'm talking about the kind of people that the Old Testament says you should avoid under penalty of death. Like sorcerers and necromancers and astrologers and mediums. How would you feel? Well, guess what? That's exactly who shows up for the baby shower that's thrown for Jesus in Matthew chapter 2. Matthew 2 is our passage for the day. If you'd like to follow along as you read, I invite you to find it in a Bible or on your mobile device. While you're finding what I would refer to as the pagan part of the Christmas story, I want to let you know that the events of Matthew 2 probably take place about a year, maybe even 2 years after Jesus is born. It's not a big deal. It doesn't really change the story. I'm just alerting you to the fact that we are messing with the Christmas timeline today. So you know, we will go back to the future or ahead to the past, whichever one it is, on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. We will come back to celebrate the birth of Jesus. We're messing with the timeline today, if you will, because we're going to look at the fullness of the Christmas story. All of the parts of the Christmas story, including the hard parts of it, which we will talk about next week, and the pagan parts, which we'll talk about today. Hopefully you found Matthew 2 by now. We're going to read verses 1 through 12 together as we jump ahead in the Christmas story. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born the King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, so if you're worried about us messing with the Christmas timeline today, I want to let you know there's actually nothing new. In fact, we've been messing with the Christmas timeline for like 2,000 years. I mean, first of all, we actually now believe that Jesus was probably born closer to 4 BC than 0 AD, which means our calendars are a bit off. Also, we believe that Jesus was most likely born in the spring, not in December. Now, the reason that we celebrate Christmas in December is because when people were becoming Christians, the church could not get people to stop practicing pagan things. Specifically, they could not get them to stop celebrating the winter solstice. As the gospel spread across Europe and all these people started following Jesus, they had a hard time letting go of some of their traditional practices. The church actually said, well, I mean, that's probably okay, but let's reframe some of these practices. And so what the church said is, yeah, you know what? Let's gather with friends and family on the winter solstice. Let's celebrate. Let's just not look to these pagan gods that don't exist. Let's actually celebrate the true miracle. That the light of the world, the King of the Jews, the Messiah, the Redeemer of God, has been born into our world. Now, of course, if you're worried about pagan things getting mixed up with Christian things, you're going to love today's passage. Because what happens in today's passage is some pagan magi, or some pagan wise men, show up at the scene. It's why you see them in your nativity sets. Now, tradition says that these magi, these wise men, that there were 3 of them. Of course, that's not exactly what the text says. It just says there were 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. There could have been more. Tradition does say that they were men, and that is probably accurate. And we know this because of the gifts, because everyone knows that women would have brought more practical gifts. What is a toddler going to do with gold and myrrh? It's like my son's first Christmas. Because Jake was the first grandchild to be born in the family, he was showered with gifts. I mean, he got a haul that first Christmas, and he got all sorts of really cool stuff, like a basketball goal, which makes no sense for a 6-month-old. The Magi were likely men, not just because of the gifts, but actually Magi were the only ones who were allowed to professionally practice the things they were practicing. This is where the wise men part comes in. And what that means is they were wise in certain things you might be surprised about, as in practicing magic and reading the stars and contacting the dead. Again, the kind of things that the Jewish law said that you could be stoned for practicing. Long story short, these are not the people that you would expect to see at a Jewish baby shower. And yet, these are people who had been waiting their entire lives for this exact moment. Matthew doesn't tell us where exactly in the east the Magi came from, but it's believed that they most likely came from Persia, a.k.a. Babylon, a.k.a. the place where God's people had been exiled for 70 years. The people of Israel were taken into captivity in Babylon, and Babylon ruled over them. That is until the Persians defeated Babylon and then ruled over them. Of course, the Persians let the Jews return to Jerusalem. They just ruled over them. That is until the Greeks defeated Persia, and they began to rule over them. That is until the Romans defeated the Greeks and began to rule over them. Now, if that sounds familiar, at least vaguely familiar, that's because a Jewish prophet named Daniel told us about this. Daniel was a man who was taken into captivity in the beginning, into Babylon. And Daniel was a man whom God used to actually not just predict the future, but to point to the coming of Jesus. Now, I won't get into the details of this today because we're actually going to have a sermon series on the book of Daniel starting in February. So book your calendar for that. For today, just know this, that Daniel had a pretty significant impact in the land of Babylon. That's because the king of Babylon began having these dreams, which we realize are from God, that there were these warnings that God was showing the king of Babylon. And when the king of Babylon sought his wise men, his magi, to interpret the dream, which was their job, they couldn't do it. Only Daniel could interpret it. God gave Daniel the ability to interpret the king's dreams, and he shared this message from God. And the king of Babylon was so thankful to Daniel that he put Daniel in charge of a region of Babylon. He put him as a governor over a province in Babylon, over all the people in Babylon, including the Magi in that region. The Magi who show up in Matthew 2 were most likely influenced by Daniel. Now, it's not that the Magi here in Matthew 2 ever met Daniel. That couldn't happen. Daniel died centuries before these Magi were born. It's just that these Magi are likely here because of the influence of Daniel in the land of Babylon and in Persia. Daniel's words were so impactful, people actually began to understand this hope that many Babylonians, including the king of Babylon, seemed to have trusted in Daniel's God. They began to believe in this idea and this hope that there was a coming Redeemer, strangely enough, a Jewish Messiah who would deliver the world from darkness. That story had an impact in Babylon, and as such, it was passed on from generation to generation, from magi to magi. Now, it does seem that it's possible that some hitchhikers were picked up and added on to Daniel's words along the way. What I mean is, the Magi in Matthew 2, they show up because they're following a star. The thing is, if you read the book of Daniel, he doesn't say anything about a star. Now, it's possible that he said something that's not recorded in the book of Daniel. That happens. Prophets say lots of things, and not all of it made it in here. It's also possible that God revealed some things to the Magi in dreams and visions. That is actually how God was speaking in the book of Daniel. Of course, I would even say that it's possible that God spoke to the Magi through their pagan practices. That is, through their astrological readings. Now, I'm not saying that you should go pull out your horoscope in order to seek God. There are much better ways to seek God, namely through His Word and by His Spirit. What I'm saying, though, is God has a tendency of meeting us where we are before He begins to change who we are. It's possible that God met the Magi in the midst of the things they were doing. That He actually spoke through the stars. I mean, if God made the stars, why can He not use the stars for His purposes? Long story short, Daniel's words had an impact. And God was moving behind the scenes, kind of in the way we talked about in the video, that He's actually doing, maybe in small things and maybe in some dramatic things, He's moving to the point where Daniel's words were passed on from generation to generation, from magi to magi, until a group of magi show up for Jesus' baby shower here in Matthew 2. It actually is really amazing that these are the people who show up for the party. It's also kind of sad that these are the only people who show up for the party. Well, almost the only people. If you look in Luke's gospel, it says there are also a group of shepherds who show up. That's why they also show up in your nativity set. The thing is these groups probably weren't there at the same time. Shepherds were in a nearby field. They were likely there about a year or so before the Magi. Don't get hung up on the timeline. Just know that both parties would not be expected to be there. The Magi for pagan reasons, and the shepherds because shepherds were kind of social outcasts. I mean, shepherds served an important societal purpose. They took care of everyone's livestock. They just were way down on the social scale. I mean, people thought shepherds were crazy. They hung out by themselves with animals all day long. They thought shepherds were drunks, and actually some of them were, because there's nothing to do when you're hanging out all by yourself with animals all day long. Because they hung out with animals all day long, they smelled like animals. And again, for all these reasons, shepherds were generally pushed to the margins of society. They were not allowed to testify in the court of law. They didn't get invited to social functions. Long story short, the people who show up for this party are not the people that you would expect to find there. It's pretty amazing. This is who's there. And it's pretty ironic, or perhaps we should say tragic, that the vast majority of people that you might expect to be there aren't there. The Jewish masses are not there. The Jewish leaders, the religious teachers, the people who studied the coming of the Messiah for a living missed the coming of the Messiah. The population at large, the Jewish people who had pinned their hopes in this, who had been waiting for this moment their entire lives, and not just that, their ancestors had been waiting for this much longer than the Babylonians and the Persians. Their ancestors had been waiting for this moment since God first promised a Redeemer way back in Genesis 3:15. And yet none of them is there. It blows my mind that none of them are there. And to be honest with you, it actually frightens me just a little bit. Because I don't want to miss God when He shows up in my life. More on that in a minute. But before we talk about that, let's just talk about one specific person who isn't at this party. That would be Herod. aka Herod the Great. Herod the Great isn't in your nativity set, and thanks be to God he is not in your nativity set because he wasn't there. And it's good that he's not there because Herod wanted to kill Jesus. Now, Herod is disturbed when Magi from the east show up looking for the King of the Jews. They come looking for the King of the Jews, and they go where you would expect them to look for the King of the Jews, to the King of the Jews' palace. Of course, calling Herod the King of the Jews is a bit complicated. Herod referred to himself as the King of the Jews. By the way, so did Rome. They made him the King of the Jews. But the Jews did not refer to Herod as the King of the Jews. They also didn't refer to him as Herod the Great. The Jews hated Herod for a number of reasons. The biggest ones is Herod was a murderer. The other reason is he was a puppet ruler for Rome. He exploited the Jews for his own benefit and conspired with this occupying force. Herod was hated, and Herod knew it. In fact, he knew that everyone questioned the legitimacy of his throne, and that's why he freaks out when Magi from the east show up looking for the King of the Jews. Now, Herod hides his rage in front of the Magi, but as we'll see next week, after they leave, he goes on a rampage. Of course, Herod first has to figure out what's going on. And so Herod calls together the people's leaders. Did you catch that? The people's religious leaders. He gets the chief priests and the teachers of the law to tell him who exactly is this Messiah. And they tell him that he will be born in Bethlehem, according to the prophet Micah. First of all, this tells us that Herod didn't read his Bible. Also, that he wasn't super religious. These are the people's leaders. Also, most importantly, he's not looking for a redeemer. He's looking out for a rival to his throne. That's when he enacts a plan. This plan, of course, started with, hey, Magi, when you go find Jesus, come back and tell me exactly where he is so that I too can go there and worship him. Of course, we know that's not true. And thankfully, God showed the Magi that's not true. God actually warned the Magi, it says in verse 12, not to go back to Herod. They probably would have lost their lives as well. God warned the Magi in a dream, which, again, notice God speaks in terms the Magi can understand. But most importantly, I would like for you to notice how all of the people in this story interact with God. The people that you might expect to be there. Like religious insiders aren't there. Despite the fact that they had pinned their hopes on this, despite the fact that they had been waiting their entire lives, despite the fact they could quote the Bible and all these prophecies, they missed the coming of the Messiah. At the same time, too, the person who is bent on stopping the Messiah isn't there. Thanks be to God. God is committed to fulfilling his promises, to delivering on this hope, and God protects the Messiah. But again, notice that it is the outsiders, the outcasts who show up at this party. The people who shouldn't be at the party are the only ones who are at the party. This is a story of grace. Do you see it? Like, this is amazing grace at work. Do you see it? Okay, but here's the question. How do you fit into this story? That is, who are you in this story? Who do you most identify with? Are you like Herod? Are you like the Jewish masses? Or are you like the Magi? That is, are you like Herod? And maybe you're flat outright just kind of opposed to Jesus. Or maybe it's not so much outright opposition. You're interested in Jesus as long as he blesses your plans and lets you be the leader of your life. But you kind of wrestle with him as to actually who's going to sit on the throne. Or are you more like the Jewish masses? Now, there is a deep devotion. There is an eager seeking. There is a desperation to know God. But you know what? You sometimes get so blinded by religious rules and obligation and checking religious boxes that you fail to miss the grace of God when it shows up in your midst. Or are you like the Magi, who, yes, imperfectly, but who desperately show up in need, in search of grace? Yes, people who are very much in process. God has got a lot of work to do here, and yet they are open to the work of God in their lives. Who are you in this story? You know, if I'm being honest, I'm all of the above. That is, I can be any of the above at any given time. The good news is God's grace is still amazing. And nothing can stop his work in our lives. Sin can't stop it. Jesus died for it. Death can't stop it. Jesus rose in victory over it. Religious blindness and box checking can't even stop it, because Jesus transforms and transcends all of the imperfect ways which we seek him. Here's why I say that. Jesus' earliest followers, his disciples, guess which category they fell into? The Jewish masses. Peter, James, John, all the people, Mary. Actually, none of those folks are at Jesus' birth. Well, actually, one Mary is at Jesus' birth. Jesus' mother Mary, obviously, ding, right? But none of the other Marys were there. And guess what? There are a lot of other Marys. None of them are there. Neither are any of the disciples. Why is that? Because the disciples were just like everyone else. They missed this moment because they didn't understand what God was doing. They were still largely blinded by the religious ways of the world, and they failed to see the grace of God when it showed up. And guess what? Not just at Jesus' birth, this is still happening at Jesus' death. If you follow the pages of the gospel, you will find that there are only a handful of Jesus' disciples who are present when Jesus is crucified. The rest run away because their hopes have been dashed. Of course, what's remarkable is a few short weeks after that, there are hundreds of Jesus' disciples gathered as he ascends to heaven. Why is that? Well, it's because Jesus rose from the dead. He transcended and transformed their understanding of the world. Suddenly, these disciples realized that death isn't the end of the story. They discovered that there is actually rescue from the darkness of the world and our own human hearts. They began to believe the truth that God really will deliver on his promises, that he will make heaven and earth one. He will make all things new. That story has been passed on ever since. In fact, that's why there are millions gathered around the world in worship today. It's why we've gathered in worship today. It's because the good news is still good news. The baby who was born in Bethlehem and crucified just outside of Jerusalem and risen from the dead and ascended to heaven, who is coming back to give every promise of God a yes and amen, to deliver on everything that God has said will be true. That is still true. The grace of God is still amazingly at work, even after all these years. The grace of God is at work today. Even in people who are still in process, even in people who imperfectly seek him. And I say that by, again, reminding you who is at the story, who is at this party. It isn't the people who kept the rules. It isn't the people who ruled. That is, it isn't the religiously pious or the politically powerful. It's the imperfect outsiders who are trying to figure this whole thing out. Yes, those people practice some things God said not to practice. Not that God approved of those things, it's just that God meets us where we are before he begins to change who we are. And for the record, he welcomes the religiously pious and the politically powerful as well. He welcomes all who seek his grace. And I say that because if you follow the rest of the New Testament, if you follow the rest of the Gospels and into the other books of the Bible, what you will find is religiously pious people. Pharisees like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea and a man named Saul, who we now call the Apostle Paul. They discovered the grace of God and began to follow Jesus. And again, not just the religiously pious, the politically powerful do as well. Those lists of names at the end of some of those New Testament letters that were hard to pronounce, and we're like, who are these people? Some of those people are members of Caesar's court. The Roman emperor's council discovered the grace of God and began following Jesus. Of course, what's really remarkable, if you flip to the end of the Bible, the book of Revelation, which begins to unpack some of those things that Daniel began to give us glimpses of, you will find that the story ends with people from every tribe and every tongue and every nation and every class gathered around the throne of Jesus. That is amazing grace. What's amazing is the God who says the story is going to end that way has entered into our now. And he is at work right now, accomplishing his purposes, making himself known, and believe it or not, actually speaking in terms that we can understand. God is revealing his grace through good things that we enjoy every day, and whether it's worship services or Christmas parties or a beautiful sunset or good friends and good wine and good food. God's revealing himself through those good things. He's also revealing himself in hard things, things that we wish were not so, like we were reminded of in the video and like we will talk about specifically next week. God is revealing himself in terms that we can understand. He is making his grace known. He is speaking. The question is, are we listening? Will we listen? Will we seek him? Will we follow him? May God, by his grace, may God, by his Spirit, enable us all to say yes, and not just with our words, but with all of our lives.